If you elect to use the MongoDB cloud, I thought it'd be helpful to walk you through the process of getting signed up and configured and connected to it. So I'm starting here at the MongoDB homepage, and you can see here one of the options on the menu bar is Cloud, and Atlas is the name of their fully managed cloud service. So you can start by navigating to that location, and then there's this Start Free button. And if you click through that, it's going to ask you to just give some information about the account you're about to create. Really easy, fill it in. You don't have to give any credit cards or anything like that. Just get started. I've already done that, so I'm not going to walk through that part of the process. It's really easy. Once you get signed in with your new account, you'll find yourself at a page like this, where you can create a new project that you can use to encapsulate the data services that you're going to be using from their cloud. So to start out here, I'm going to create a new project, and I'll just call it Cause 343 Sample, and click Next. Now you have the option of adding additional members to a project team if you want, which you don't have to do here because this is just going to be for your own use in these homework assignments. And it already adds you as the owner of the project because that's the account that you're logged in with. So hit Create Project. And each project has a cluster or multiple clusters. A cluster is basically just a way to create a higher performance and redundant instance of Mongo. And we're going to actually talk about that some more in class. But we need to create a cluster, and we can do that by clicking Build a Cluster. You can get different kind of performance characteristics and stuff for your clusters. Obviously, for us, we just want to start with a free cluster. So we hit Create Cluster, and now we get some options here where we could choose, which provider to use. You can see that MongoDB isn't actually hosting the equipment that their clusters are running on. They're using services from either Amazon or Google or Microsoft. So there's some different options here. I would just say, choose the default, particularly because you can see here again that you're going to get a free cluster here. Your monthly estimate is 0 per month. So you can just click Create Cluster, and that's going to generate the appropriate configuration on the hosting provider that you've chosen and so forth. And that's going to take a little bit. It says here new clusters take between 1 and 3 minutes to provision. So you might want to pause the video until that's working and then restart it, and we'll pick up from there. Okay, so the cluster's been configured, and the next thing we want to do is, we want to create an account on our database and connect to it. There's a couple different ways to do that. You can actually go through here and do individual database access and network access things, but there's a really handy kind of a wizard approach to doing this where you can just click on this Connect button, and that's going to open up a dialog that's going to kind of walk you through this process. So the first thing we want to do is set up a firewall or configure the firewall that's going to sit in front of our MongoDB instance. So the MongoDB service by default wants you to create a firewall that's going to restrict the IP addresses that are allowed to connect to that database from across the internet. That's a way to kind of filter out the bad guys to a first approximation. And so there's several options for doing that. Basically going to say these are the IP addresses that are going to be allowed to connect to my Mongo database. The first option here, add your current IP address. Basically, when you connect to their website here, it passes along the IP address that you're using, and it's offering us a chance of saying, hey, I'm going to use this one from now on, so go ahead and add this to my list of available IP addresses. Now, I'm working at home right now, and so this is actually the IP address that's been assigned to me by my internet service provider. I don't know if that's going to change or not over time. It may not. But if you're sure that your IP address isn't going to change, this might be a good option. You'd go ahead and type in something here as a description, my home connection, something like that. You can also give an arbitrary IP address or use CIDR notation if you know what that is, and give it a little description. The final option is you can just allow access from anywhere. So you can see here that the IP address is somewhat unusual looking, and this is basically just saying accept any IP address at all. So basically you're disabling the firewall. And I'm going to do this because it's probably the most flexible way of approaching this. You're not going to get painted into a corner if you happen to connect from a different computer that has a different IP address. It's not very secure, right? We're not using the capabilities of this firewall mechanism to prevent bad guys from getting to our database. But for this project, we probably really don't care. So I'm just going to put in here wide open connection and then add an IP address. Okay, we have to create a database user that we're going to use to log into our database. So I'm just going to give myself a username of Tom, and for my password, I'm going to type PASSWRD99, I think, show. Yeah, doesn't have to be super sophisticated, but again, this is for a homework assignment. We would be much more circumspect if we were configuring this for production use. So create database user. And then it says, don't forget this, right? Because you'll need your database credentials in the next step. All right, now we're going to choose a mechanism for connecting to our shiny new database. And there's several ways to do this. One is that you can use the Mongo shell that we've kind of talked about before. You can also use the second option if you have an application that you've written, like code written in Python or JavaScript or whatever, and you want to be able to connect that code to the Mongo database in the cloud. You can go here and get information about how to do that. So here's a bunch of options, right? Here's for Node, for Perl, for PHP, Python, Ruby, all these other different drivers that are available for Mongo. You can get information about how to configure those things here. You can also, if you'd like, download the a nice user interface for accessing the database called Compass, and that would be another way of getting access. So if you already have it installed, you can just go ahead and grab the connection string. If you don't, it actually gives you some options to let you download it. And I rather like the Compass program, so that certainly would be an option for you. What I'm going to do is kind of the simplest, lowest common denominator thing, and I'm going to create a connection with the Mongo shell. Now, if you don't have Mongo or the Mongo shell installed locally, either on your laptop or on a lab machine or whatever, you have the option at this point to download an executable that will contain that shell. So you can say, well, I have the Mongo shell installed, and it just says, well, sorry, we're not going to offer you that. But if you don't have it installed, then you get some options about how to go about doing this. I'm running on a Mac, so apparently the user interface here defaults to selecting the Mac, and it's telling me that the easiest way to do this is to just use the Homebrew package installer to make to install Mongo on my laptop, which would be totally fine. There's a bunch of other options in here. If you're on Windows, you get some different options. If you're using Amazon Linux, Red Hat Enterprise, Ubuntu, SUSE, Debian, right? There's a lot of different distributions of different operating systems where they've provided you with an executable. So you can choose the machine of interest, probably either Windows or Mac, or if you're running on a lab machine, I think the current install of Linux on the lab machines is Ubuntu 20.04. So you would choose that, and then you can then choose to download the code itself, or you can click to copy the URL from which you can download it, and you could, if you have a different download manager, or if you want to use wget or curl or some kind of a command line thing to download this code, that would work fine too. I'm going to just skip this step because I already actually have installed Mongo using Homebrew. So I've got that client available to me already. You can, step number 2 says add the directory or the bin directory that you downloaded here in step 1 to your path variable if you want to make that shell easily accessible from your command prompt. You can also just download this. If you do download one of these other clients, it's basically going to download as a tarball that you can untar, and then you can just cd into the directory where the Mongo client itself is located inside the bin directory of that thing that you downloaded. And you can run it from there directly. So if you want to put it in your path, you can. If you don't want to put it in your path, you can just kind of run that manually. The most important part here, though, is you've got to be able to give the Mongo client some information about how you want to connect to your shiny new MongoDB service. So they give you the connection string for your particular platform. And then I'm going to switch back over here to Mac OS so that I'm sure I get the right one, although I don't think it's going to matter. And here from my shell, I can show that I actually have Mongo already installed. If I say which Mongo, it tells me it's in user local bin Mongo, which is the standard location where Homebrew installs executables. And now all I have to do is paste in the command that I copied from the dialog box. And you can see that it's going to run the Mongo command, the Mongo shell, and it's going to connect to the URL that was supplied to me by that dialog box. One thing I don't want to use as is here is the name of the database. So I'm going to change this to say testdb, for example. And it's also currently giving me the username that I typed in when I created my database account. I'll still have to supply the password, but now it'll make that connection for me appropriately. So we get a prompt from the shell, and it asks me for the password, and I'm going to type in my dumb PASSWRD99 again. And now we get a connection string, and the finally get the prompt there from MongoDB Enterprise Atlas. I've also, because I used that testdb name for the database when I connected, there's an explicit construction of that database as soon as I start adding information into it. So for example, db.songs, so the songs collection .insert one, and then I'm going to have a title, country road, artist James Taylor, and that's enough. And close that off, and we get a little acknowledgement from the database. And now I can, for example, do show collections. Oops. And you can see that we've now got a songs database or a songs collection in there, and I can say db.songs.find with no arguments, and that should give me all the songs. I can go back and say pretty to get that to look nicer, and there's the song that I inserted in the newly constructed object ID. So you can continue to use this until you're done interacting with the database, and then hit Control D to exit back out to your shell. Switching back here to the Mongo management window, we can see some useful information here about what we just did from our local shell. In particular, we can look at the collections that are defined on our database, and it takes a little while to go fetch those things. And here's that, here's our test database, right, that we created. We implicitly created this songs collection, and that's what it's showing us here. It's telling us that here's the current contents of that database. Pretty simple. This users collection is one that I created earlier, and that it also allows us to illustrate that we can get rid of those collections. So we need to verify that, yes, we really do want to get rid of this. And you can say drop, and that will get rid of that collection. And then it comes back, and now we just have that songs collection there. Some other things here that you might want to take a look at. First of all, database access. This, again, is the account information for how we connected to the database from our Mongo client. So we have to use that user ID. And then also network access. This is the list of IP addresses that are allowed to connect to the database, or the list of filters that are going to be applied to that firewall. And you can see here, you'll only be able to connect to your cluster from the following list of IP addresses. And of course, we added the one that was the most wide open. But if you had chosen to do a specific IP address or something else, you can come in here and make changes to this if you wish.